It's that time once again. A card that has the word enchantment on it, is 4 or more mana, and mentions something about base power and toughness has recently been printed, so you better believe we're talking about Bello again. The card in question is March of the World Ooze from Aetherdrift, a 6 mana enchantment that says creatures you control have base power and toughness 6/6 and are oozes in addition to their other types. And whenever an opponent casts a spell, if it's not their turn, you create a 3/3 green elephant creature token. In case you need a refresher, Bello Bard of the Brambles is a 3 mana 3/3 that says, during your turn, each non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater is a 4/4 elemental creature in addition to its other types, and has indestructible, haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. For those that have seen my previous videos about Bello, let me know in the comments down below what happens when we have a March of the World Ooze in play, and then cast Bello. What power and toughness will March of the World Ooze have? Before we jump into the answer, it's important to understand exactly what Bello and March of the World Ooze are doing. Both March of the World Ooze's first ability and Bello's ability are both types of continuous effects. As per Rule 611.1, a continuous effect modifies characteristics of objects, modifies control of objects, or affects players or the rules of the game, for a fixed or indefinite period. The easy way to remember this is, if something changes the printed information on a card, that's a continuous effect being applied to it. Now, seeing as we have two continuous effects here and they're interacting with each other, that means we need to look at my favourite page in the comprehensive rules, the page that contains Rule 613, Interaction of Continuous Effects. That's right, we're talking about layers again, but before you click away, know that I actually want to focus and go into a specific rule on layers that not too many people cover. Okay, here's the very basics of layers you need to know. There are 7 types of continuous effects: copy effects like clone, control effects like mind control, text changing effects like spike it, type changing effects like storm tide leviathan, color changing effects like devoid, effects that add or remove abilities like humility, and effects that change or set power and toughness like giant growth. When we have one or more of these effects in play, we apply them in order of the layers list from top to bottom. Let's take a look at Bello and March of the World Ooze and see which layers they impact. If we go down the layers list, we can see we have an interaction at layer 4. Both Bello and World Ooze are attempting to change types. Going further down the list, we can see that Bello is adding abilities, that's on layer 6. And finally, both Bello and World Ooze are trying to set power and toughness, that's layer 7B. Now that we know what effects we're trying to apply here and what layer they're on, the next question is, when we get to a layer that has 2 or more effects, how do you know what order you apply them in? For example, on layer 7B, we have Bello trying to set creatures to 4/4s, and World Ooze trying to set things to be 6/6s. This is where we need to learn about 2 things: dependencies and timestamps. Let's start with the easier one first, timestamps. Basically, whenever an object enters a zone, it gets a timestamp. Timestamps are effectively a marker showing the age of something. For example, if we played Bello and then we played March of the World Ooze, Bello would have an older timestamp than March of the World Ooze. There are a couple of ways things can get new timestamps. If you flickered Bello from the previous example, Bello would have re-entered the battlefield, entered a zone, and would get a new timestamp. There are a couple of other ways that objects can get new timestamps, but that's for another video. The important thing to take away from this is that continuous effects generated by a static ability have the same timestamp as the object that the static ability is on. One thing I see get brought up every time I talk about Bello is that, does Bello's ability get a new timestamp each turn? No. The continuous effect timestamp is tied to Bello itself. the only time an ability would get a new timestamp is if it was a triggered ability. So if Bello's ability said, at the beginning of your turn, creatures you control become blah blah blah, that would be a triggered ability, and the ability would get a new timestamp each time it triggered. So now that we know what timestamps are, the final thing to learn is that we apply continuous effects on the same layer in timestamp order, oldest to newest. And before anyone asks, if multiple permanents enter the battlefield at the same time, starting with the active player, they choose the timestamp order for their permanents, and then you repeat this process around the table in AppNap order. Okay, now that we know about timestamps, we need to learn about dependencies. And this is the topic that I really wanted to make clear, as this has tripped me up in the past when looking at rulings. Now, while we usually apply continuous effects on the same layer in timestamp order, sometimes we do it based on dependencies. A dependency is said to take place when a later effect on the same layer would impact the first, or more specifically, an effect is said to depend on another if A. It's applied in the same layer as the other effect, B. Applying the other would change the text or the existence of the first effect, what it applies to, or what it does to any of the things it applies to, and C. Neither effect is from a characteristic defining ability, or both effects are from characteristic defining abilities. Otherwise, the effect is considered to be independent of the other effect. If we look at March of the World Ooze, we can see that it wants to make creatures oozes in addition to their other types. And Bello turns things into creatures, and these are happening on the same layer, layer 4. So if we had March of the World Ooze in play first, then played Bello, if we followed the timestamp system, we would give all creatures the ooze type, and then Bello would make artifacts and enchantments creatures, meaning the creatures that Bello animated wouldn't also be oozes. So here we can see that Bello's ability directly impacts what March of the World Ooze will be applied to. In other words, March of the World Ooze depends on Bello's effect to be applied first, so that it can make all creatures into oozes. While this isn't a massive deal for this example, it's good to be aware of dependencies for other interactions. So back to the original question. What happens when we have a March of the World Ooze in play and then cast Bello? As discussed, we know that effects here come into play at layers 4, 6 and 7b, so we'll run down the list and apply them. At layer 4, we know that March of the World Ooze is dependent on Bello's effect, so we'll apply Bello's effect first, making each non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater an elemental creature in addition to its other types. We'll then apply March of the World Ooze and make them oozes as well. Going down the list, we get to layer 6 and give each a non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment with mana value 4 or greater indestructible, haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. We then come to layer 7b, where we're setting power and toughness. Here, because neither Ooze or Bello is dependent on each other, as they all apply to the same thing without changing what the other would apply to, we simply apply these effects in timestamp order. So because March of the World Ooze was in play first, we apply that ability first, making all creatures 6/6s. Then we apply Bello because they have the newest timestamp and turn all the non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment creatures into 4/4s. So there's your answer. March of the World Ooze will be a 4/4, but all other non-artifact, non-enchantment creatures will be 6/6s. Now, bonus question. What happens if we now play Humility? So that's what happens with Bello and the World Ooze. If you learned something, be sure to like the video and subscribe, because if you don't, Bello will summon Eldrazi to Muruganda and you'll never find out who this is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.